live in a world where it is amazing to me how people feel that they have the right to sit in judgment on men and women of God. But the Apostle Paul went through the same thing. In Corinth, he was always compared to the super apostles. He talks about them a lot in 2 Corinthians. And these people who claimed that he was just an apostle, but they were super apostles. And because of the patronage system of ancient Corinth, they compared Paul with others, and they all sat around discussing and judging preachers. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4, beginning with verse 1, "So look at Apollos and me as mere servants of Christ." He said, now that's how you're supposed to think. He said, don't think about us as some big shot. He said, don't think about us as a celebrity. Paul would be completely humiliated by this new celebrity preacher concept. He said, look or think about Apollos and look or think about me as mere servants of Christ. He said, that's all we are, is a servant of Christ. And we have been put in charge of explaining God's mysteries. He said, now that's how you think about us. If you want to know who we are, think about us as simply a servant of Christ who has been put in charge of explaining the mysteries of God. He said, now a person who is put in charge as a manager must be faithful. He said, all right, so God requires one thing from my life, and that's faithfulness. He said, I've been put in charge of explaining the mysteries of God, and I must be faithful to that. He said, I'm not expected to be faithful as a celebrity. I'm not expected to be faithful as a marketing manager. I'm not expected to be faithful as a product salesman. He said, I'm supposed to be faithful. I'm expected to be faithful as a manager of the mysteries of God that I am entrusted to explain. And he said, as for me, he said, now that's who I am. So he said, just get this straight. You want me to be this, and you want me to be that, and you want me to be this, and you want me to be that. But he said, I'm none of that. He said, Apollos and I are simply servants of Christ, put in charge of explaining the mysteries of God. And all God expects me to do is be faithful at that. God doesn't expect me to be faithful as a businessman. God doesn't expect me to be faithful as a singer. He just expects me to be faithful as a person who explains the mysteries of God. He said, now, as for me, it matters very little how I might be evaluated by you. He said, you sit around and evaluate me. He said, it matters very little to me. It's not really relevant in my life what you think of me. Now, that may sound a little arrogant, but every pastor has to come to that place in life where it matters very little how I might be evaluated by you or by any human authority. He said, I don't even trust my own judgment at this point. Paul said, I've lived long enough and figured out I've made enough mistakes in life. I don't even trust my own evaluation of myself at this point. He said, my conscience is clear. He said, so, I keep my conscience clear. I'm doing the best I know to do. But that doesn't prove I'm right. He said, it is the Lord himself who will examine me and decide. Paul said, you know what? I'm not qualified even to judge myself. It is the Lord who will judge, examine me, and decide. He says, so don't make judgments about anybody ahead of the time before the Lord returns. For he will bring out the darkest secrets to light and will reveal our private motives. And notice our private motives. Paul said, you know what? You sit around in judgment on these preachers, but you don't know their hearts. You don't know who's trying to do things out of their own personal interest. And you don't know who's trying to do things out of a good heart. You don't know. Paul said, listen, and he will reveal he includes himself in that, our private motives. Then God will give to each one whatever praise is due. On that day, when we stand before the bema seat of Christ, we will finally see what praise is due us as men and women of God. Until then, you know what? Paul said, it matters very little to me what you think about me. Pastors, you're going to have to stop keeping your happiness in everybody else's head, as my Uncle Lester used to say. Other people's heads are a poor place to keep your happiness. Keep your conscience clean. But at the same time, what really matters is what God thinks of us and not what people think of us. They don't know our hearts. God does.